back, everybody. This is the Changelog, and I'm your host, Adam Stacoviak. This is episode 137, and today, Jerod and I talked to Ryan Rauh, the maker of HuBoard. HuBoard is a Kanban board for GitHub issues. Fun conversation today with Ryan about open source, licensing, taking contributions, building his business on top of somebody else's business, GitHub issues, their API. A lot of fun conversation. We have some awesome sponsors to mention for this show today. CodeShip, TopTal, and DigitalOcean. We'll tell you a bit more about TopTal and DigitalOcean later in the show, but our friends at CodeShip, big shout out to them because they just launched a brand new design. Looks beautiful, by the way. CodeShip is a hosted continuous deployment service that just works. You can easily set up continuous integration for your application in just a few steps and automatically deploy your code when all your tests pass. CodeShip has great support for lots of languages, test frameworks, as well as notification services. They easily integrate with GitHub or Bitbucket and can deploy your code to cloud services like Heroku, AWS, Nodejitsu, Google App Engine, or even your own servers. Setup takes just 3 minutes, so you can get started today with their free plan, and make sure you use the code the Changelog Podcast to get a 20% discount for 3 months on any plan you choose. Again, that code is the Changelog Podcast. Make sure you use that code. Head to codeship.com/thechangelog. Tell them we sent you. And now on to the show.
What's up, everybody? We are back. This is Jerod with the Changelog. Got Adam Stack in the house. Adam, what's up?
Adam Stack. Yes, that's me. Woohoo!
And we're joined today by Ryan Rauh with HuBoard.com. Ryan's a guy we met down at Keep Ruby Weird in the fall. Enjoyed talking to him, and we're interested in what he was up to with this open source product. Ryan, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, guys.
Austin, Texas, man.
ATX in the house.
ATX, but you're not from ATX.
Oh no, I was
Cornfields.
I'm originally
Potatoes.
from northeast Iowa.
Northeast.
Teeny tiny town called Cresco.
Okay.
Yeah.
My hometown butts up to the Iowegians.
Iowegians.
But that's on the west side, of Iowa.
I've never heard that before. Iowegians.
You from the great state of Nebraska?
That's right.
Omaha.
All right.
But
I've drove through there a few times. It's pretty fun to go 95 plus on I-70.
yeah, not much to see, but you can definitely drive fast because there aren't too many folks around either.
Right.
So Ryan, tell us about HuBoard.
So what is HuBoard? What does it do? I get asked this all the time, and I keep trying to refine it. When I first launched it, it was GitHub issues made awesome. But I've been trying to better describe it as it's really like a project management solution for teams and or GitHub organizations. The reason I say that is because we don't really just deal with GitHub issues anymore. We've added some features around linking repos together so you can have this holistic view of your your entire project. So you can link repos together, and you can also manage milestones across multiple repos. So which was kind of a challenge to implement as well.
So it's kind of broadened in scope over time, but when you first kicked it off, it was you were using GitHub issues. You thought they were lacking this project management visual Kanban thing, and you decided to build it. Were you just scratching your own itch back in the day?
I guess it was really born out of a need, or maybe even a hatred of other tools that I've used in the past.
You want to name any names?
I don't think the great hatred tool needs to be mentioned. More like the Baltimore.
Yes,
right?
the tool that will not be named.
Everybody's used the tool that will not be named, and although I'll just come out and say it's usually Jira, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a fantastic tool for businesses. It's so configurable almost to a fault, right?
Yes.
You can put so many rules dictating the flow of your issues with that tool that sometimes it gets cumbersome to use. what really made HuBoard come about was, a little over 3 years ago, I came to Austin to work for a company, and we were building a really complex, as far as like business rules and requirements, enterprise application for like large enterprise HR needs. And so there was a lot of rules around like who could see what data and things of that nature. Like we really had this fine-grained requirement to lock down security down to like the field level of like Sally Sue can't see the salary of X person, right?
Yeah.
If they're not in this certain role. And so to fit that bill, we actually ended up building a web framework, and we decided to open source it to try to like kind of get a groundswell or like a force multiplier of productivity. And so we, of course, hosted that on GitHub, and that framework was called Fubu MVC. So sort of as open source developers on GitHub, we were in GitHub, love GitHub. We ended up choosing it for the business side of things as well. And so rather than using multiple tools, we kind of settled upon GitHub issues for the product side of things, right? And what we kind of found was, the simplicity of it is fantastic for an open source project, but it has some shortcomings as far as like communicating to a business and prioritizing a business's needs, versus an open source like project.
Okay.
GitHub Issues is fantastic, but it doesn't really have any prioritization or any sense of where things are, whether they're in progress or, in review. I don't know if you guys have ever personally tried to use GitHub
Yes.
like issues to manage a project.
We've gone off and on using that between we use Trello now, but we mainly don't use GitHub Issues because we use Trello and we have business sides of the house that need to sort of play a part in moving cards around and seeing the state of things and commenting and coordinating and stuff. So Trello fits for us, but we did try GitHub Issues way back in the day, and it was label hell. It was, the same thing you're talking about. You couldn't really tell where something was at in the process. So, and that's what we liked about Trello, which was this sort of Kanban approach to how you can do things.
Right. And Trello's fantastic too, right? Like it's extremely simple, and for non-technical stakeholders, it's a lot easier to say, oh, hey, here's this tool, and it really only is around like issue management or like project planning, rather than trying to get a non-stakeholder to be like, oh, hey, okay, so we use this thing called GitHub,
right.
And you have to explain what GitHub is, and then you have to they have to go create an account in it. And they're like, well, why do I need this account just to manage issues?
Right.
And
yeah, very confusing.
So there's definitely
we have that with documentation too, because we have wikis and some documentation in our repos, and it's just like, unless you're a developer on the development team, you don't see that stuff, and or they do, they just forget they have a GitHub account, and they don't know how to log in. It's just like, it's totally foreign to them.
Right. And so, back to being at this company, we ran into all these problems, right? Because we didn't want to use different tools, and at this point we have hundreds of open issues, a lot of them 2 to 3 years old in GitHub. And, we started making duplicates of old issues. So it just became a bit of a nightmare to manage. And so we started playing around with the API and trying to find solutions as to how maybe we could better organize them. Right. And so we came up with this tool called, at the time, I think we called it Hookshot. And so what we did is we subscribed to the issue webhook, right? And so anytime an issue was closed, if it didn't have this reviewed label, we would basically reopen it and add a needs review label to it and assign it to our QA engineer. Mm. And so for a while that really worked. So, we would basically create an issue in GitHub, and then we would use the linking part. It's a feature in GitHub where if you reference an issue number in a commit message, it will actually link that SHA and that commit in the discussion history of a GitHub issue.
With the timestamp and stuff.
With a timestamp, and you could like click on it and go, and you can like actually make inline comments on like a certain line of the commit, and those actually come through into the GitHub issue discussion. And they actually have some really fantastic features around like really integrating it in with your code, right? And so that really helped like our testing and QA engineers see like they could go to so they would get tagged with needs review, right? And they would get it assigned to them, and they'd look at it and be like, and they would be able to easily reference back into the code, like what actually changed. And so we like really fell in love with that functionality. And when we hit some of these shortcomings of GitHub, as far as like communicating the business what we were doing, right? Because we're programming, right? We're busting out features, we're being productive, but you know, some of the stakeholders didn't really see that. They didn't really understand how to extract that value out of GitHub, right? Because they didn't really see it. Like, you can't see the progress. And so we didn't want to lose that code linking, but we saw this need for like visibility to the business. So we started looking at tools like Trello, like Pivotal Tracker, like Jira. And I came up with a crazy idea. I was like, well, what if we had this conventional label, right? Almost like a Kanban board. Like we could just name a label like with a certain pattern, and then I could use the API to pull all those labels and then turn those into columns. And if you drug one issue from another one, I just remove that label and add the other one, right? Mm-hmm. And so, you know, I just spent a weekend or two hacking on it. And that was what birthed the first version of what eventually became HuBoard. And at that time, I called it Inch Pebbles.
Inch Pebbles?
Yes, it was a playoff of milestones.
Okay.
Inch Pebbles.
Like
nice.
Milestone, Inch Pebble.
Got it.
And so
clever.
Yeah, very clever, right? And so Inch Pebbles was born. It was hosted on a free dyno on Heroku, right? I'm a .NET developer. I don't know any Ruby, so I write it in Ruby because, you know, Heroku was like free, and I kind of wanted to learn Ruby. So it was just kind of like this
is 2011,
side project.
Right?
Yeah, it's 2011. So it's just like the side project. It's running on a free dyno. It really only like you couldn't create issues or anything. It was effectively like you could navigate to this page that had the same URL structure as GitHub, and you would see this Kanban board just magically appear as long as you had these specially named labels. And we could drag them, like basically say, hey, here, business, here's this Kanban board that can just show you this like read view of what we're doing.
So
right?
It sounds like you could still use issues as normal with a dev team, but hand them HuBoard, the business team HuBoard, and just specially name some labels. Is that what you're talking about at this point? Where you still had issues and it still worked the way issues works, but you can use this in tandem.
Right. It's really just a different view on top of GitHub issues. Like there's no separate data model. Like it would pull the issues from the API and create cards from each issue. And it would look at the labels on the issue. And if it had one of these conventional labels on it, it would then be in that column. It would just be represented in that column,
Gotcha.
Right?
Yeah.
And it just had a really simple like jQuery draggable. Like, oh, if you drag it over here, then it just made an API call that removed X label and added the other one, right? That represented the new column. And so it just was born out of pure need and pure simplicity, right? I started showing people that I knew. I'd be like, oh yeah, I made this cool thing. Check this out. And like, I would just show it to people. And they're like, yeah, that's cool. Like we would kind of be interested in using that. So I was convinced to like show the world, like reveal it, like let people use it. So I go shopping for the domain name Inch Pebbles, and it's taken.
What?
It's like, yeah, it's like parked by this blog.
Man,
so I just didn't want to. I didn't want to go through the hassle of trying to get that name from whoever, randomly had it.
Somebody else thought of Inch Pebbles. That's what I'm impressed
I
by.
guess. I don't know. And the
nice.
tagline of this blog is like dealing with life's milestones or something like that. I mean, like it even had the same wordplay.
Same exact play.
It was so great. So then we started, brainstorming on names, and it was like, things were thrown around like octocards, octoboard, kind of playing off the Octocat thing.
Mm-hmm.
But then that didn't really have anything to do with like a board or I don't know. So somebody just threw out like, what about HuBoard, right? Like the play on words from HuBot.
Yeah.
And so it had some like, it kind of had like a backwards tie in back to GitHub, but it really kind of gave us gave me the freedom to sort of be unique in a way or claim that I wasn't. So like if you ever wanted to like use it or like build an adapter for a different issue tracker, maybe the word would or the name would still be relevant.
Yeah.
So yeah, HuBoard was born.
And Jerod and I were saying we thought it was HuBoard. HuBoard. I don't know.
HuBoard.
Too many. I don't know. It was.
There's not two
HuBoard.
B's.
I don't know. It was just I was lost.
As you guys, you probably know this, Ryan. As developers, we spend most of our time reading words on the internet.
Yeah.
And we don't ever have to say those words out loud to anybody. And so we all come up with our own, like, just rendering of what that actually sounds like. And then we get together with other developers and we finally use that word. And they give us this stare like, man, what are you talking about? And you just realize that, like, my version of that word is just, like, completely does not line up with reality.
It's like OzCon or OSCon.
Yeah.
Or Imgur.
I don't even know what that is.
See?
Yeah, you never go on Imgur?
Yeah, exactly.
MIGUR.
Oh, now I know Imager.
.com?
Yeah, exactly like that.
Yeah.
No, it's Imgur. Definitely Imgur.
Imgur.
So you mentioned, switching out, the possibility, because the name is a little bit distinct, that you could have a separate back end, which makes me think of one concern that I had, hearing about it is like, because you're building a business, you've built a business around HuBoard, and we'll talk about, kind of some of the challenges and things that happen around this business around an open source product. But were you scared to, obviously not scared enough, but did it bother you or that you're building a product on top of somebody else's product?
At first, I really didn't, I guess I didn't have, when I set out to build it, I didn't particularly have the intention of turning it into a business, right? So my concerns around not having the stickiness of the tool, I like to call it stickiness, right? Like, I don't own the data model. It literally all that controls HuBoard is still in GitHub, right? HuBoard is not the single source of truth at all for what represents the state of the board. So there's really not much stickiness in the tool.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's really easy to use it, try it out, even use it for a while, and then maybe you outgrow it and you could go to something else. There's nothing keeping you using the tool, right?
That's a blessing and a curse, though, because you also have, it's really easy to try it out, too.
Right.
So there's your blessing. The curse is it's also really easy to just ditch it.
Just to ditch it. So being that I didn't set out with the intention of turning it into a business, I didn't really care that it wasn't sticky, right? And also, it was kind of a thought experiment, or even just like a challenge, kind of like it was fun to try to see how far you could stretch using an API and not have a database whatsoever, right? Like HuBoard existed, and I kept adding features like linking repos together, custom ordering of like keeping the order of where cards were, flipping the board on its side on like milestones where the columns were milestones, being able to order milestones as on like a custom order instead of the due date. Mm-hmm. All these things I was able to do for free. Like, I didn't have a database. Like, it cost me nothing to host it. It pretty much lived on a free Heroku dyno for like over 2 years. Wow. I think at its peak, when I wasn't charging any money, it was somewhere around like, and again, like, I didn't have intention to make it a business, so I didn't even really have any metrics on like how many users there were, right? The only metric I had to go by was like GitHub has this thing when you create an application, they'll show you how many keys your OAuth application has authorized.
Mm-hmm.
And so at the time, it was like somewhere around 6,000 or something, right? I don't know how, I've never spent $1 on marketing or anything, but somehow like it just groundswelled into like all this interest in people using it. And it didn't cost me anything to host. So I was like, oh, okay, la-di-da, like I just kept trying to stretch it, see how far I could take it without having a database. And then when the time came to where like it kind of got so big that other companies saw it as like an opportunity to make money, I had a decision to make, right? It was like, let my experiment die. Like, let the thing I built die to people who were like turning it into a business or turn it into a business myself, right?
All right, let's pause the show for a minute. Give a shout out to a sponsor. I want to talk to you about TopTal. We've been working with them for the last year, and it's just been a great time working with them. We thought it would make some sense to circle back and talk to some of our listeners who've applied with TopTal and have been accepted, because only about 2 to 3% of the engineers who apply make it past their strict elite engineer process. And that person is Daniel Lazon, a longtime fan and listener of the Changelog. He is now living the dream as an elite engineer at TopTal. And I say living the dream because he's now able to have 100% control of the types of projects and technologies he's working on, as well as the rate he wants to charge. Daniel earns 100% of his income as a TopTal engineer, and he wanted me to pass on his seal of approval, so to speak, of the TopTal experience. And for those of you out there who are freelancing or who would like to test out freelancing or even try out a no-risk freelance-like project while you maintain your full-time position, you got to check out TopTal. If you think you have what it takes, head to TopTal.com to get started. Tell them the Changelog sent you. And now back to the show.
And you had some real competition come in and
Right.
offer a very similar product. Is that fair to say?
There's a couple of competitors that have come into the space, and some of them are like really, really similar as far as like almost clones. And
Like
then
fork
there's
your
others,
repo. Yeah.
right? Now, I don't think anyone's forked the repo per se, but they definitely were largely inspired by HuBoard, right? And that's not bad. Like, competition is good, right? It convinced me that it was a viable thing, right?
Yeah.
It inspired me to like take it seriously and take it to the next level and like build in things like SSL support and stuff like that. At the same time, like if I could do it all over again, it sure would be nice to have some inkling of stickiness to the tool, right? Like, but at the same time, like it's okay, It still gets a lot of interest and a lot of people use it and like it, even though I guess it's a challenge to keep the tool compelling and good enough that people stick around, even though there's really no reason to,
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a testimonial for the tool.
It's awesome you got there with no marketing too, to have that many OAuth keys in use. Is this? I'm looking at our notes, and I've got a note here that April 19th, 2012 was when you said somehow on Twitter, HuBoard grows to 400 users. Is that the 6,000? Is that post that or before that?
I don't remember. I was preparing for the show. I was trying to go back in my Twitter history and like figure out like how big it was at certain points, right? And that was just a random tweet that I came across, right? So HuBoard.com really kind of launched, like, I wouldn't say it like actually launched, right? Like, I told people about it on my personal blog in January of 2012, and by April, 4 months later, there was already 400 people like using it. By the time like I got to the 6,000 mark was when I really took it to like actually formed a business out of it and launched it out of free for everyone, over a year later, somewhere in like October of 2013 is when I actually like
HuBoarding came into play.
Right. So when I formed like an LLC to actually charge money to people, it was over a year, later.
Yeah.
And it had grown up to like that many like user keys that had been authorized.
That's not
crazy. that's probably not like a fair metric as to how many people were actually using it, right? Like, because some people would maybe like check it out and then, you know, you tick the number. But it was still pretty impressive for me. Like, you know, you just keep getting into those like 10-based milestones, like, woo, 1,000, woo, 400, you know, like every 100 I would kind of be pumped up.
So you had all these free users, and there was all this interest and buzz despite no marketing. Then competitors come in, and they start to offer your product or a very similar product to yours for pay. And so you decide at this point, I'm not going to resign. I'm going to man up and turn it into a company. And you relaunch as a business, paid accounts. Did the people just, you know, fork over their money immediately? Or was there still a moment in there where after you had turned it into a company and decided you're going to start accepting money where, you know, you had all the free users, but nobody was interested in paying, or did they just sign up right away?
Yeah, so that was an interesting thing. You know, it was foreign territory to me. When you take a thing from free to for pay, you know, out of the blue, a lot of people go the route of grandfathering in, you know, the people that are already using it. I didn't do that, maybe out of laziness or maybe out of like urgency to put it out there. So when I launched it with anyone who signed up within the first year got a 6-month trial. I basically I saw that as a way like, hey, I'm sorry, like I got to turn this into like something real. I understand you're using it for free. If you sign up, like I'm not charging anyone, you know, if you sign up before November 1st, you get 180 days free trial, right? Which is like a really long time. And there was maybe 1,000, like after you do some analytics and slicing and dicing of who's using it, there was maybe like 1,000 potential like paying customers at that point. Mm-hmm. And I was just kind of okay with the fact that I wasn't going to convert all of them, right? And that's in fact what happened. Like it ended up being that I didn't convert everyone. I lost a large majority of those people. It's sort of like starting from scratch. But like I guess any SaaS business, it's kind of like that. It's a slow linear growth until you hit that thing that makes you like do that exponential bell curve, and then like everybody uses it.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's been a little over a year now, and we've hit, you know, being fully bootstrapped with zero outside funding. You know, we've been able to, I have hired my first full-time employee, which is absolutely nuts, about a year later. All, you know, just kind of bootstrapping it, staying profitable, staying soluble the entire time.
Well, congrats on that for sure.
Yeah.
You know, for those who don't know, this is completely open source. So if you wanted to check out HuBoard, you could just go to github.com/RauhRyan/HuBoard, which is always admirable and interesting when we see people building open source products and then also turning those into businesses that are successful. I think the stigma is that, you know, that won't work because people will just clone it or run it themselves. I mean, your audience is developers in a large part. I guess we can talk about your growing customer base and how it's turning more enterprise next. But first, I want to ask you about the open sourcing of it. I'm sure it was probably open source from the beginning. Is that fair to say? It's been open source from day one, or did you open source it at a certain point?
It was like just open source from day one, right? Like
Yeah. And so you have
I just threw it out there. Like, hey, here's this random cool thing that I built, you know, for fun. I open sourced it from day one. I made it MIT just out of like, I guess, randomness. Like, oh, I'll just pick that one. That one sounds good.
And you also have a contributor license agreement too. How does that differ from the MIT?
So I actually added that later. I added that after I turned it into a business. And that was more because when it turned into a business, I did, you know, it's just out of ignorance. I had no idea, like, well, what if somebody does fork it? It is MIT. So someone could host it and make zero changes and charge money for it. That is completely within legal realm, and you can do it, and that's fine. MIT does not stop you from doing that. So when I launched it, I was contemplating changing the license to AGPL, which would kind of prevent people from doing that in a way, hosting it and then gaining money from it. But then I actually never did that. I just left it. Like, at the end of the day, like, no one did it. No one forked it and just tried to make money on it. And I'm not the only, like, HuBoard is not the only company out there that has figured out kind of a way to charge money or at least sort of make a living off of their open source contributions. I mean, Docker's doing it, Vagrant's doing it, Discourse is doing it, Mike Perman, I'm probably going to butcher his name.
Aram, yeah, we had Mike
Aram?
on last summer talking about his business around Sidekick.
Yeah, he's been able to do a really similar thing to HuBoard, right? And like productize, he kind of has this open source version and then this pro version, right? And that's kind of the same thing as HuBoard, right? Like, you can certainly host HuBoard yourself, right? But I think that we're within the realm of reasonable pricing that even if you do it on Heroku, all of the components that run a production instance equal or are less than just paying for HuBoard.com, right?
Which also makes it keep getting developed and
right,
hiring employees and supporting the software, upgrading the software, current version of Rails, you name it, right?
Right. One of the things is when I launched it in October, you couldn't even create issues. You had to go to GitHub to create issues. It was literally like,
so you're just like organizing,
right?
Read
like,
only or not read only,
Yeah.
but
nah, it wasn't read only,
Edit only.
but it was like maybe I have this perfectionism in me, right? That I was like, well, I don't want to provide a UX that's not as good as GitHub, right? And I saw like creating issues as like, well, there's a lot of ways to create issues, and that's a lot of effort for me to do that. For the most part, I didn't see it as like that big a deal that you had to go to issues, go over to GitHub to create your issues, right? But feature parity became like my highest priority when I started charging money for it, right? Like, when you're not charging money for something, you kind of have this leeway to be like, yeah, I don't have that, right?
Yeah.
right.
But when people are paying money for it, they don't really
They expect
take that as an excuse, right? So charging money for it, like, funded improving of the tools, and that actually goes back into the open source version. So, I wouldn't have done those things if I wasn't charging money for it, right? Like, I'd probably still be like, nah, you just go to GitHub for that, right? Or use a command line tool. So coming up to feature parity was a big thing that was funded by getting money. Increasing the performance is something that is funded by that, and enterprise support as well. So, things get better if you pay for them, right? Like, everything can't be free, I guess.
So there's this old story about Apple and Dropbox when back when Steve Jobs wanted to acquire Dropbox, and he kind of took the strategy of making them feel like they needed to be acquired, because he told them, all you are is a feature. You're not a business, you're a feature.
Mm-hmm.
And that was not a winning strategy for him at the time, and we all seen what has happened with Dropbox, grown to be a massive company since then. I think perhaps a naysayer of HuBoard would say, are you not just a feature of something that GitHub could add, and then you'd be out of business? Have you thought about that?
It's looms in the back of my mind, right? Like, but then I wonder, part of me thinks like whether or not that's really what their focus is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, their focus right now is, how do we make collaborating and sharing code more important? Like, you see it in their entire tool chain, is that GitHub is about sharing your code, right? Like, you can even see it in their permissions models, right? Like, when you give somebody OAuth access to your repo, you get everything. There's no way to just say, oh, give me issues only, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think it flies in the face of their entire business model, right? Like, they exist to share code. So why would they cripple their own tool and not give you access to code? If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So
Well, I would think of it as a feature add on top of issues. Like here's like you said, HuBoard was a view. It's a different view into issues.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's grown. So that was kind of the initial feature, the initial conceit.
And they've also done some redesign to issues too. Like it's gotten, full width, and there's been enhancements over the years of issues too. So they've definitely been paying attention to the usefulness of issues. And
according to their blog post, they spent 9 months on their latest redo of issues. And 9 months of work, and it didn't really significantly change.
Mm-hmm.
They still, I think, to the core, they don't think you need anything more than what is there. And in some aspects, I agree. The original vision and my vision for HuBoard is not to particularly change the way you should use GitHub. It's kind of to enhance the way that you use GitHub, right? Like, I believe wholeheartedly in GitHub flow. My own personal development flow is, right, like, I have master, and master is always deployable. And when I want to work on something, I cut a branch, and then while I'm in that branch, depending on what I'm working on, every commit is tied to an issue number, right? So that I have like this full traceability into whatever it is or was. And then at the end of that turns into a pull request. That feature branch turns into a pull request, and somebody other than me looks at it and merges it in, right? And that's how my entire team, the two of us, that's how we work, right? Like, we don't require like a daily stand-up meeting or anything like that. Like, we collaborate through like
the tool itself,
like GitHub itself. And really HuBoard is an effort to like enhance that or make that easier or like visualize that workflow, not like change it. You know what I mean? Like,
let's ask a different question then. What if, let's say there's a GitHubber listening to this. Let's say it's Chris Wanstroth for whatever reason. He's listening to the changelog. Hi, Chris, by the way.
What's up, Chris?
And he's like, you know what? I like what you did here, Ryan. And he wants to acquire you. Is that an option for you?
I guess. I don't know. I would take an unsolicited offer any day. I don't know necessarily.
Do you want to become a GitHubber?
It depends.
Jared's chuckling over there.
Everything,
giving you a hard time, Ryan.
Everything for sale at the right price.
You're giving me a hard time, but like, is that an out strategy that I've thought of course, right?
Sure.
Maybe. It depends. Like anything, it depends.
Yeah.
It comes back to that question too that Jerry was asking earlier, which is, well, I think even you mentioned it, Ryan, which is that you could write an adapter for a different application other than GitHub issues and still take HuBoard and do something with it that's useful. I think what we're trying to get at here is how much anxiety looms over you over the fact that you're building a business on top of a business, and that even the data model you don't have control over. And at the end of the day, you're not the the canonical data source even. Yeah,
and I do. I wouldn't say it keeps me up at night, but yeah, I think about it. I definitely think about it. Not being the single source of truth. As far as like the viability of a business, I'm not concerned, right? I have a skill. It's called, I'm a developer. I have a skill. I built this thing. Like, even if it fails, at the end of the day, I'm not going to be unemployable. But yeah, once you turn into a business and you have employees, your concerns change, right? Like, I'm more concerned about the well-being of the person that I convinced to come work for me than I am for my own well-being. So yeah, that really concerns me. Yeah, at the same time, I don't think GitHub is secretly working on a Kanban view for issues.
Probably not. Yeah.
I don't think so.
I would think
I'm not worried about it. I just wondered if you were worried about it.
Right. I would think that they're ethical enough to let me know, or at least
I don't know, man.
Maybe business savvy enough to be like, to at least exhaust acquisition avenues before committing their own development time to it.
Yeah. Let's pause the show for a minute. Give a shout out to a sponsor, DigitalOcean, simple cloud hosting built for developers.
In 55 seconds, you'll have a cloud server with full root access, and it just doesn't get any easier than that. Pricing plans start at only $5 a month for half a gig of RAM, 20 gigs of SSD drive space, 1 CPU, and 1 terabyte of transfer. That's a lot for $5 a month. DigitalOcean also has data centers all across the world: New York, San Francisco, Amsterdam, Singapore, and their newest region, London. You can easily migrate your data between those regions, making your data always closest to your users. Use the promo code ChangeLogNovember in lowercase. It's important that you use lowercase. ChangeLogNovember to get a $10 hosting credit when you sign up. Head to DigitalOcean.com right now to get started. And back to the show.
You said that GitHub acquisition would be a decent exit strategy for you, but the fact of the matter is that you don't need an exit strategy at the moment. You have a growing business, a very small, probably overhead, and you have some increasingly large customers. Perhaps a surprise to you is how many enterprise customers you have on your homepage. I see Microsoft, Mozilla, Adobe amongst your customer list. Tell us about the enterprise and your success there and challenges.
So on the enterprise site, those are actually SaaS.
Oh,
users.
are they? They're not.
Yeah. The dirty little secret is that when you get into enterprise, I really am contractually restricted from telling you who actually bought it. If that makes sense.
So by enterprise, you're speaking of a different product. This is an on-premise product as opposed to just like a large enterprise company that's using your SaaS product.
Yeah. Over the lifespan of HuBoard, there's been a lot of interest in providing GitHub enterprise support, right? So a lot of people may not be aware of it, but GitHub offers an on-premise version of GitHub. Right? You can go to them and they will give you a virtual machine that has GitHub installed on it. And you can basically, as simple as importing it into your vSphere or your Essex environment, you spin up this VM, you upload like this package, they call it the GitHub package, the GHP, and a license file, and you hit a big green button, and like an hour later, the thing's fully provisioned, and it is literally like GitHub inside your network behind your firewall, which is really incredible way to like deliver software. It's really fascinating, and there was like tons of interest for people that were like, hey, we want to use HuBoard for our internal GitHub Enterprise instance, and it seemed plausible, like
you weren't sure.
Well, it was like, well, they claim that their API is fully compatible, like it should work the same. So, it should be as easy as, we'll just point it at GitHub Enterprise and it should work, right?
Right.
It turns out that big companies are not particularly interested in, they weren't or aren't like interested in taking the open source version of HuBoard and sort of hosting it themselves and pointing it at their GitHub Enterprise, right? Like there's some challenges around configuring it correctly and updating it, and like you're going to have to pay a full-time engineer, right? Or somebody to maintain the thing. To know how to, like, if I made changes to the database, right? Like it uses CouchDB. That's not like a widely used or commonly known thing. Like, how do you migrate documents in CouchDB? That's kind of a thing that isn't going to be easy for me to like put in a wiki, and I'm not particularly going to want to sit down with somebody who isn't paying me money and walk them through how to do it, right? I'm likely going to be like, no, that's okay. I'm not interested. That being said, there's a ton of interest in enterprise support, and maybe me being a perfectionist, I really wanted to give the same experience as GitHub Enterprise itself, right? So we set out to build a virtual appliance that, kind of like reverse engineered GitHub Enterprise itself and tried to build the exact same experience.
Did you collaborate with them at all on that? Did you like work with the GitHub Enterprise team by any chance?
So no and yes. At the time, it was like, for a long time, it was this growing interest in it, and I was like, well, does anybody want to like loan me their GitHub Enterprise environment so I can test this thing? You know, at the time, I didn't have any money. I'm not going to go pay $5,000 for a license to GitHub Enterprise just to test something that I don't even know anyone would pay for, right? And so I asked GitHub for, you know, a license to GitHub Enterprise. And they were like, "Oh yeah, here's a 90-day free trial," and then, you know, like 90 days later, I still didn't have a product, you know. And so, you know, I think part of that effort kind of got them in gear to start their developer program. And so now, like, you just enroll in their developer program, and you get a license to GitHub Enterprise now, which is really nice for integrators like myself. But as far as like building the virtual appliance itself, like, there wasn't a whole lot of back and forth with the enterprise GitHub. I did ask them, you know, we asked them some questions around, like, you know, how are you exporting, you know, how are you creating this OVA that like cleanly installs into VMware and stuff? And they actually like were really helpful. And someone from their team like provided us with like this code that, like, I think that was like our one hanging point, was like we couldn't get it to cleanly import into VMware without it complaining about its manifest file being corrupted. And so yeah, they definitely helped with that. Yeah, they helped. They helped.
They helped.
That was
Nice.
a really long explanation to yes. That's
Well,
the help.
it's just interesting because, I mean, that's one of their obvious directions in their business, and you just wonder how flexible they are to, and even them helping you with that enterprise integration might give you some, you know, signs of bright spots, whether or not they're going to, you know, consume you at some point.
Well,
You know what I mean?
Well said.
Yeah.
Consume
You know-
you, take you over,
Well
eat
said.
you, whatever, you know, stomp on you or acquire you, whatever you want to say. Yeah.
It sounds like you had some technical challenges around creating this virtual appliance. Any interesting stories or neat solutions that came out of that, technology-wise, or maybe even the toolkits that you're using to build this virtual appliance?
You know, the interesting thing is there isn't a lot of tools out there for this.
No Stack Overflow.
Not really. You know, there's no guide or screencast on like, or blog about like how to create a virtual appliance. Like, how do you create this virtual, you know, how do you create this VM that gets deployed on someone else's network that, you know, if you sell this thing to a Fortune 500 company, you're going to see big boy networks, I like to call, right? Like, these things are like locked down. You need like, if you want to reach out to the internet or outside of their firewall, you need credentials to get out of their, you know, their proxy servers. So things that you take for granted, like gem install or bundle install, try to do that without the internet. You know, things like apt-get install without the internet. Handling things like self-signed SSL certificates.
Man, I can't do anything
Like-
without the internet. I try to get on an airplane thing. I'm gonna get a whole bunch of coding done. It's gonna be awesome. And then I realized I didn't prepare some sort of docs I need, and I'm just like, screw it. I'm gonna watch a movie or something.
Right.
Funny.
And then supporting something that you can't touch or
Yeah, how do you do that?
see. Poorly.
Oh, fair enough.
It's a lot of back and forth. Sometimes it's screen sharing.
Yeah.
You know, one of the biggest challenges usually is around SSL. Customers will configure GitHub Enterprise with a self-signed SSL certificate, or they'll use like a certificate chain that isn't installed by default in Linux. And so getting those onto the machine is probably the biggest hurdle. And then, you know, you run into challenges of like, you have to configure the network to speak to internal name servers to, because like, how do you resolve github.company.com when it isn't in, a public name server? It's in an internal name server, right? Like, so you're given this string of this host name, but you have to talk to like an internal DNS server to get the IP of the machine. Yeah, it was challenging, right? And coming from a guy who started his career as a .NET developer and then did this out of a whim, wasn't even a Ruby developer, and having to debug some of these things like OpenSSL peer verification, and like, going from a front-end heavy developer like to a full-fledged DevOps engineer is something I never expected my career to take a path to.
So is it worth it?
It's worth it. Like, so I've had a couple people who they're also building kind of GitHub focused products that like extend GitHub. I've had them approach me and say, ask me questions like, how did you start this? What's your relationship with GitHub? And I've also reached out to other ones like Travis CI. I've had conversations with Matthias, I think his name is, and asked him questions about like how they do stuff. And, it comes up like, do you regret like doing enterprise support? And, at the end of the day, no, of course not. Like it's very lucrative, but you're talking about, in some instances, it's a 10-month sales cycle. So unless you have that SaaS backing to like sustain you through that 10-month sales cycle, it's not going to be fun, right? It's a lot of work. There's a lot of red tape you have to go through to sell to large enterprises, but it's a learning experience, I'll tell you. Like, if you guys ever really want to know, like the contract negotiations and, stuff like that.
Pain in the butt.
It can be.
Well, since we're talking about pains in the butts, maybe it's a good segue to something that's probably a deeper topic, which we may not have the full amount of time we should actually give this. So I don't know if it's something we could talk about in, the sub 10 minutes we have for this show left or not. But can you talk briefly about the technical stack that you built upon? I know you started in 2011 from a Java background.
.NET.
Used Ruby. Or sorry, was it .NET?
It was .NET.
.NET.
Okay, I remember talking earlier to you about somebody throwing on a Java project. I thought Java for a second. So doing Ruby mainly to use Heroku for free or One Dino. Can you talk about your tech stack and just what you're using to any degree?
Yeah, sure. The HuBoard API itself, is effectively a Sinatra app. I've rewrote it probably 4 times and they're like improving it and stuff. And I settled on, and I'll give a little shout out to forget his name, Andrew Macare.
That's what I call him.
He wrote like a tool called Monocle, and I think he has a new like app called. He's a big Sinatra guy. He wrote a tool called Trevi, which is like a little like some patterns he uses to build Sinatra apps. So I eventually refactored to that, and it's good. I think eventually we will rewrite majority of it in Rails. I like to say that there's a lot of paper cuts with Sinatra, and once you get to a certain size, it's just a lot easier just to go with Rails. Like Rails is pretty fantastic in that regard. The front end, I rewrote in Ember.js and love it. It's great. I highly recommend Ember. It's such a.
When did you rewrite?
Oh, last year, January-ish of last year is when I released the full Ember rewrite. Previously, it was Backbone, and 3 years ago, Backbone wasn't even 1.0. I think I started the project with Backbone 0.3.3. So it was definitely bleeding edge from the start, and even with Ember, it was still pre 1.0. we store some things in CouchDB. We, of course, use Redis as part of our stack, Memcached. We do some real-time communication stuff with WebSockets. And that was kind of a journey. I started out with Socket.io. That worked great for like 2.5 years. It was like 40 lines of JavaScript that I never touched for 1.5 years. And then I had some problems with that and moved to a hand-rolled like Sinatra streaming server. And then I had some problems with that, and then eventually settled on Fay.
I've used Fay in the past. Nice tool.
It's not perfect. I really wish that I could use something like Pusher or PubNub. But
why can't you?
Enterprise. to be short and sweet.
Yeah,
Enterprise.
I
have to be really cautious in particular about the technology choices that we make, is because everything still needs to run on a VM for enterprise, right? So some of these really fantastic services are kind of out of reach unless they're easily hosted,
Yeah.
We're doing some things around right now. We're doing some things around improving in performance, speeding things up, and building some business insights and some analytics into lead times of cards, things of that nature. We've settled on the Elk Stack, Logstash, Elasticsearch, Kibana. Puppet, of course, is the magic that GitHub or HuBoard Enterprise is built upon. And then, shout out to Heroku. They've been fantastic. We're still on them to this day. I think HuBoard chugs along. I think we have 6,000, average monthly active users, really pounding it. And we're on 2 extra large dynos.
Nice.
Or not extra large, but the 2X dynos. So, it's pretty great. We have some things on AWS, of course. I guess that's pretty much the whole rundown of our stack.
Awesome, man. Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time. Otherwise, we would question you on individual choices. Why Ember? Why Couch? We love those kind of questions. But
I had more questions. We just can't answer them right now. We can't ask them. Can we maybe ask this one question before we ask the final questions?
What you got?
Is I don't know if you've, and maybe this is a short one too, which is the fact that you're open source and accepting contributions and pull requests. I know we talked about the license there, but did we just kind of close a loop on how you deal with forks and pull requests back to the open source version and how that plays into just this fact? Because it brought that up in my mind whenever you mentioned enterprise and how every time you make a choice on what to use and code to add is based on whether or not enterprise can support it.
We don't get a whole lot of pull requests, and bad on me. There's one in particular that's been open for a while, which is add milestone. It's been open for a couple months, and unfortunately for him, it was like in the middle of a big rewrite that I made, and so some of his stuff didn't merge in cleanly. Accepting contributions is hard. It's difficult ethically, and it's difficult legally too. I don't really know the specifics, but I guess to try to cover all my bases, I do ask people to sign a contributor license agreement, which basically just says, kind of do whatever we want to do with your code. That being said, anything
within
that's
the MIT license, though, right?
Right, within the MIT license. Just ethically and for me, like if somebody contributes something significant to the open source version, I will do my best to continue to support it for forever. Like I'm not going to take large contributions lightly, right? Like if someone contributes something that's significant, I'm going to make sure that I can support it, because you can't really trust somebody else to be there forever, right? So if I do, I will make sure that it's going to be supported forever. Other than that, there's people that have forked it. Crushpath is a big one. I think they're a San Francisco startup. I know that they run a fork, and they've added tons of features that are important to them. And then for a spell, Shopify had a fork that they were working on, but that kind of disappeared. I'm not sure if they privatized that or or what went on there, if they decided to do something else and deleted it. But there are people that exist that have forked it and added features that they care about, but they necessarily haven't contributed back, if that makes sense.
Sure.
All right, Ryan. Well, it's time for those closing questions. As a changelog listener, you probably saw this one coming, our old favorite. Who is your programming hero?
This kind of changes on a frequent basis. I always look up to a good friend of mine, Charles Lowell, Cowboy D on Twitter. But lately, my programming hero has really been my girlfriend, who is a budding female learning developer. About 6 months ago, she left her cushy support job and did a leap of faith, and she's learning to be a developer. So
nice.
That really, it's fun to see her learn and grow, and to do it at kind of a later age as well. When you already have an established career. And
taking the risk,
Yeah, it's a big deal. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of in awe and a bit of a hero to me. So gotta give a shout out there.
Awesome, man. Make sure she listens to this so you get them brownie points too. Don't miss out on them brownie points. Next up, and a new question, trying to share the podcast love a little bit and give some shout outs to different podcasts out around the ecosystem. So you're a podcast listener. Please, if you would, share with us a couple of your favorite podcasts.
I'm a big fan of the JRE, the Joe Rogan Experience. If you guys haven't heard of it, Joe Rogan, yes, the one and only Fear Factor host from way back in the day. He has one of the most popular podcasts in the world, and strap in. It's 3 hours a piece, but I don't know. I
what
enjoy.
What do you think, Jerry? You think we should do the changelog for 3 hours now, or what?
That's a long experience right there. It's a long experience.
What else? Any other shows you got on your?
I listen to you guys, of course. I'll listen to the Frontside podcast.
Like front end development or design, or what's that?
The Frontside, it's Charles's little just personal thing.
Cool.
I've listened to Ruby Rogues and JavaScript Jabber. Sometimes I still tune in to Herding Code, which is like a .NET focused one. I'll listen to the Ruby 5x5.
Mm-hmm.
You mean Ruby 5?
Ruby 5.
The Ruby 5?
5x5
you mix Ruby 5x5, and I was like, is that a new one?
Could be a new one.
No.
Ruby 5. And then you got you also have a Ruby on Rails podcast on 5x5. So
that's right.
You can probably add that one to your list too, like that show. We obviously love podcasts. We appreciate you listening to our show. That's totally cool. And I guess to wrap up the show, it's been great talking to you. I know we saw you back at Keep Ruby Weird in Austin. What was that? October, Jerod? We were there? October?
Yeah, October.
September? October.
Mm-hmm.
That was good times. We do have some pending video we shot there, and you'll get to see Ryan's awesome face on the video. Sharing once again his other programming heroes. Not you didn't mention your girlfriend in that one, but maybe she wasn't your hero.
Keeping it fresh.
Keeping it fresh. Yeah, Ryan, has been great having you on the show. I know we're definitely excited about where you're going with this, and it's fun to see. We've seen this time and time again. You mentioned Mike Parham and others, Tim Caswell. The list goes on of people that have been on the show that have done something in open source and found a way to make it free and open source, but still make a business out of it and support it. And we think that's always great we want to highlight that when we get a chance to do so. So
yeah, I really appreciate you guys letting me on. One
thing I want to say too, just as a close to this, it's a two-part thing. One, to promote our ping issues on GitHub, and two, just to kind of maybe get a shout out from listeners of the show that use HuBoard. If you are a user of HuBoard, or if you love this show, go on to our GitHub issues. It's github.com, of course, /thechangelog/ping, and submit a new issue. If there isn't one yet, and if there already is one, just go and throw a comment on there and give a shout out back to Ryan about just using HuBoard and what you thought of this show or whatever. That'd be super cool to just kind of see who listens to this show and see who's using HuBoard and try to connect the dots a bit. But we do have some pretty awesome sponsors that help make this show possible. We got CodeShip. Definitely love CodeShip. Who doesn't want to have tested code in production, right? That's the name of the game, right? Rackspace and TopTal keeping us on the airwaves. Yes, Rackspace, CodeShip, and TopTal, friends of the show. They support us, they love us, and we hope that you love them too. But that's it for this week of the Changelog. We'll be back next week. But for now, let's say goodbye.
Goodbye.